The negotiation table was a slab of cold Vethian marble, and everything on either side of it was trying to kill something. Corvin Hale had been sitting at that table for 11 hours. He had eaten nothing since the shuttle docked. The Vethian delegation had not offered food, and he had not asked for it, because asking was a form of admission and admission was a form of weakness, and weakness at the Vethian Conclave's opening session was roughly equivalent to arriving with your throat already cut. He had a translated brief open on his data slate, and a glass of water that had gone warm 2 hours ago, and he was looking across 20 feet of polished stone at the woman who had the power to end or continue the blockade that was currently starving 6 human colony worlds. The Sovereign Veth. That was the title. The Human Diplomatic Corps had 100 informal names for the Vethian Queen, the Pale Sovereign, the Ice Empress, the Needle, and every one of them had been coined by humans who had met her in formal session and come away feeling like something had been removed from behind their eyes. She was not what any of them had described, and she was all of it at once. Tall, taller than Corvin by half a head, which meant taller than most humans by more than that. Skin the color of old ivory, pale to the point of translucence at the wrists, where the faint branching of vein light showed blue-silver beneath the surface. Hair so white it read as luminous under the chamber's cool overhead panels, worn loose to the shoulder in what Corvin had been briefed was a deliberate breach of court custom. The Vethian Queen wore her hair bound in public. That she had come here unbound was a message, though no one in the human core could agree on what kind. Her eyes were the same blue-gray as deep water seen through ice, and she had not blinked when they were introduced. She had simply looked at him, and he had felt the look the way you felt a change in cabin pressure, not painful, just a sign that the environment was no longer entirely your own. Her name outside the title was Sarathiel. He was not supposed to know that. It had not been in any briefing. Her attaché, a narrow-shouldered man named Irvin Sorrel, had let it slip in a corridor during the third recess, and Corvin had filed it without comment, the way he filed everything, quietly, completely, and without letting it show on his face. "The human delegation's position on the Murrith corridor," said Deputy Ambassador Castle to Corvin's left, for what was probably the 7th time that session, "has not changed. The blockade is a crisis instrument. It was invoked in response to the Terran Station incident, and the terms for its lift have been clearly." "The Terran Station incident," said the Queen's first voice, a Vethian woman seated at the Queen's left, whose sole function appeared to be speaking the Queen's responses, so the Queen herself did not have to, was a response to the human garrison's failure to evacuate the agreed exclusion zone. "The sequence is what matters. You are debating the answer while refusing to acknowledge the question." This was how it had gone for 11 hours. The humans stated a position. The Queen's first voice restated the Vethian position. The Deputy Ambassador restated the human position with additional emphasis. The Queen said nothing, or almost nothing. She had spoken directly 4 times all session, 3 crisp corrections of her first voice's phrasing, and once, early in the morning session, a single sentence addressed not to the Deputy Ambassador but to Corvin. "You were at Terran Station." It had not been a question. "I was," he'd said, 3 weeks after the incident, clearance assessment." She had looked at him for a moment with that pressure-change look, and then returned her attention to the table. Irvin Sorrel had written something on a small card and passed it to a guard, who had passed it somewhere else. Corvin had made no note of it. He had learned a long time ago that the things people watched him notice were often less useful than the things they didn't watch him notice. The session dragged through its final 2 hours without resolution. Corvin tracked the arguments not because he expected them to go anywhere. They wouldn't. He could see the shape of the session, could see where Castle was willing to move and where he'd planted himself, could see the same immobility on the Vethian side. But because his job was to know what had been said, exactly, so that when someone asked him in a week what the Vethian third-seat counselor had meant by his offhand comment on the corridor's secondary shipping lanes, he would be able to tell them. He had been good at this job before the Terran assessment. He was still good at it. He was simply no longer in a position where being good at it did very much for anyone. He thought about that sometimes. He tried not to think about it at the table, but the table had a way of making things obvious that were easier to forget elsewhere. The session ended without resolution at the 22nd hour of the station's artificial day cycle. There were two vessels docked at the conclave port, the human diplomatic cruiser *Ardent and the Vethian state ship Sorvith Vel *, which translated, approximately, as * the Queen moves forward, which Corvin thought was either a statement of intent or a very old piece of Vethian political poetry, and possibly both. The two delegations were assigned to separate accommodation wings of the conclave station's residential tier, which was courteous and deeply practical, since the courteous fiction of separation meant no one had to watch anyone else do anything as compromising as sleeping. Corvin's quarters were a long, narrow room with a bunk on one wall, a work surface, and a porthole the size of a dinner plate that looked out on the dark. The Murith cluster was visible on a clear cycle, a smear of pale amber light against the deep field, and he found himself standing at the porthole for a while after the session closed, not thinking about the blockade or the deputy ambassador's strategy or the dossier he needed to reread before morning. He was thinking about the Terran station exclusion zone, and the 612 people who had not been in it when they should have been, and the 3 weeks he had spent trying to write a clearance assessment that was accurate without being a weapon that could be used to justify another 11 months of blockade. He had not done a good job of it. He wasn't sure a good job was possible. He ate a ration bar from his kit, drank the water that had been provided, cold, faintly mineral, slightly wrong in the way all alien station water was slightly wrong, and lay down on the bunk without undressing past his jacket. He did not expect to sleep. He was therefore considerably surprised, sometime in what he estimated was the 4th hour of the artificial night cycle, to find that he was not alone in the room. He came awake the way he always came awake, not with a start but all at once like a light being switched on. His hand moved toward his kit before his eyes were fully open, stopped when the profile registered. Not a threat. A person sitting in the chair at his work surface in the dark, very still. He lay for a moment and let his eyes adjust. The Sovereign Veth was sitting in his chair with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap and her white hair down, and she was looking at the porthole and not at him, and she was alone. Corvin lay still and said, very calmly, "Your sovereignty." "Don't," she said. Her voice without the chamber acoustics was lower than he'd expected, quieter, "not in this room." He sat up slowly. He was careful not to move fast, not out of fear of her, but because fast movements in the dark were startling, and she had come here without guards, which meant she had done something that cost her something, and he did not want to make it harder than it already was. "How did you get into this wing?" "The same way I get into most places," she said, still looking at the porthole. "By asking whether anyone had thought to tell me I was not allowed there." A pause. No one had. He thought about that. "Your people don't know you're here." "My people know exactly where I am," she said. "They simply do not know that I know that they don't know where I am." That's a sentence. It is the relationship between a sovereign and her guard, in 6 words with all the other words taken out. She turned her head and looked at him. In the dark her eyes caught the dim running light from the porthole and gave it back silver. "You didn't call for anyone." "No." "Why not?" Corvin thought about the honest answer and decided the honest answer was the only one that would satisfy her. "Because you came alone, which means you came on purpose, which means you want something that couldn't happen in the session. Calling anyone would end whatever that is before it started." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You were accurate in your Terran assessment. We have read it. He felt something in his chest go very still. It wasn't supposed to. It was not supposed to reach us. I know. Deputy Ambassador Castle would, I think, rather eat the document than see it in Vethian hands. But your system of document classification has what my analysts call optimistic gaps, and one of those gaps put your report in front of me 4 months ago. She looked at the porthole again. You wrote that the exclusion zone failure was shared. That the Vethian Conclave's notification timeline was inadequate for the garrison's actual evacuation capacity, and that the garrison's response to that inadequacy was worse than it needed to be. You did not apportion blame to one side. That's what I found. That is not what was useful to either side to hear. She turned back. Do you know what it cost you, your assessment? He knew. A lateral reassignment and a reduction in delegation rank that had taken him from deputy attaché to third-seat analyst in 14 months. He said, some professional standing. More than some. She regarded him steadily. I am here because I have read your Terran report, and because I have been at that table for 11 hours, and because I find that I cannot sleep in the room my people have assigned me, and because she stopped. He watched her jaw shift, just slightly, the way a person's jaw shifted when they were cutting off a sentence at its honest end, and replacing it with something more manageable. I wanted to speak to someone who has no investment in the answer being one particular shape. I'm human, he said. I have an investment. You are human, but you wrote the Terran report. She stood, which surprised him. He had thought this would take longer, that she would sit and build toward whatever she had come to say. But she stood and moved toward the door, and he realized she was leaving, and something in him moved before he had decided it would. You could stay, he said. She stopped. He kept his voice level. I don't sleep well on stations either. There's a spare blanket in the kit locker. The bunk's narrow, but it's flat. I'll stay on this side and you can have the wall, a beat. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm saying the chair isn't made for sleeping and you clearly haven't, and neither have I, and sometimes the only useful thing left is just. He ran out of the honest version and used the next one. Lying down in the same direction for a while. She stood at the door with her back to him for a long moment. He could not see her face. He could see the line of her shoulders, which were very still, and the white fall of her hair, and the way her hands were at her sides, not fisted, not tense, just resting, the way hands rested when a person had stopped fighting with themselves. She turned around. You will not, she said, make anything of this. I won't make anything of this, he said. She crossed back to the bunk. He moved toward the wall without being asked. She noticed he could tell, though she said nothing about it, and she sat, and then she lay, and he drew the spare blanket from the kit locker and spread it over without ceremony, and that was all. He lay back on his side of the bunk, close to the edge. Neither of them spoke. The porthole framed a small piece of the dark, and the Murith cluster was there, amber and faint and very far away. He wasn't sure which of them had spoken first, later. He thought it might have been her. She said into the dark, Have you been to the colony worlds, the ones under blockade? 3 of them, he said. Wren's Reach, Caliver, and the Kestrel stations, not Murith itself. What are they like? He thought about Wren's Reach first. The smell of the settlement markets gone wrong. The way a food market smelled when the supply chains had been compressed into a single monthly dropship, and everyone knew it. He thought about the woman in Caliver who had been running a small medical clinic from a converted cargo container, and who had run out of a specific anticoagulant 3 months before the blockade's first review date, and had lost 2 patients to what should have been routine post-surgical recovery. He thought about the children at the Kestrel stations, who were fine, genuinely fine. The Kestrel people had managed their situation better than most, but who played in corridors that were a little too empty, because a quarter of the adult population had left on the last open transport to find work in systems that hadn't been cut off. Struggling, he said. in the specific way that places struggle when they know the difficulty is external and they can't resolve it themselves. They're not starving, not yet, or not most of them, but they're in the territory before starving, and the longer it goes on the further into that territory they go, and some of what's lost in that territory doesn't come back. She was quiet. He could feel that she was listening, not the active listening of the session room, not the strategic attention of the table, but something quieter, something that was simply receiving what he was saying without running calculations on it. "I have not been to the colony worlds," she said. "I have read reports. My conclave economists have models." A pause. "Models are not the same as the smell of a market." "No," he agreed. "I know that. I am not." She stopped. Then, "I know what I do not know. I have always known it. It is one of the things that is difficult about the title. You spend a very long time reading what other people say about what they have seen, and what you cannot verify is whether what you are reading is what was actually there, or what was considered appropriate for you to know." He thought about the Terran report, and the chain of reasoning that had produced its particular shape, and what it had felt like to write a document that he knew was accurate, and he knew would be inconvenient, and he had written it anyway because he could not write a different one and still be the person his late father had spent 30 years trying to produce. "That's why you read my report," he said. "Not because it was useful to you, because it was what was actually there." A very long pause. "Yes," she said. The station made its quiet sounds. The kind of sound stations always made, the deep bone hum of the life support cycling, the faint tick of the hull contracting in the cold, the barely audible movement of air through the vents. He had slept on enough stations that the sounds were normal to him. He wondered if they were normal to her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "The unbound hair," he said. "What it means. I know I was briefed on it, but the briefing gave me 2 different translations and I don't know which one applies." She was quiet for a moment. What were the 2? Morning or challenge? Another pause, this one with a different quality. The quality of a person who has been handed an accurate description of something they were not certain they were ready to describe. "They are not," she said slowly, "as different as they may seem to an outside reading. In Vethian court tradition, the bound hair is the self under governance, the self that is managed. The unbound hair is what remains when governance is removed." She paused. "When worn publicly, it is read as a statement. I came to this summit as myself, not as the title. Whatever is built here, I am in it as a person, not as a symbol." "And the mourning?" "Because to come as yourself rather than as your title is to acknowledge that you are mortal, that you can be wounded, that the outcome matters to you in a way that cannot be managed." A pause that felt like something being held carefully. Mourning and challenge are both forms of that acknowledgement. He lay still and thought about that for a while. "I read about your predecessor," he said finally. "The previous sovereign. The account the human core has is," he considered the phrasing. "It describes her as having found the blockade unnecessary, that she was in the process of recommending its review when she died." He felt the stillness in the body beside him change. Not tense, just more concentrated, more present. "Yes," she said, "she was." "How long ago?" 11 months before the summit. The review was tabled when the succession was formalized. My first conclave council took the position that it was premature to continue a review process during a transition period. A pause. They were not wrong, and they were not right. They were what a council is, which is cautious and procedural and invested in maintaining a structure that they know how to operate. Another pause, smaller. The blockade was already 2 years old by then. It had become, for some of them, simply what existed, a feature of the political landscape rather than a decision that was being made. "And for you?" She said nothing for a moment. Then, "My mother was planning to end it. So I inherited a blockade my mother had already determined was wrong, And then I inherited a conclave council that was afraid of what ending it quickly would mean for their own credibility, having maintained it for 2 years. A pause. This is not an excuse. It is a sequence of events that produce something I am now trying to change, more slowly than I would like, with more friction than my mother would have encountered. He said, "That's not a position your first voice was going to give at the table." No, it is not the kind of thing that can be given at the table, because the table has an audience, and the audience includes my conclave council and certain kinds of truth, said in certain kinds of rooms, make the people who need to move in order for the truth to matter dig in harder instead. She paused. Which is why I am saying it here, in the dark, to a human third-seat analyst who wrote an honest report and was moved sideways for it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because it was the honest thing and not saying it would have been a small dishonesty he couldn't justify, "I'm sorry about your mother." She said nothing for several seconds, long enough that he thought he might have trespassed into something he didn't have the standing to touch. Then she would have liked the report. She had a great deal of patience for accurate documents. A pause. She had very little patience for inaccurate ones. It was a quality that made her effective and occasionally exhausting. Another pause, softer. I have tried to keep both of those qualities. I'm not certain I have managed it in the right proportions. The blockade is still running, he said, carefully, which suggests you've managed more of the patience for difficulty than you may think. Someone with less would have done something dramatic and counterproductive a year ago. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, something quieter, more private, that he suspected she did not often produce in the presence of other people. My conclave council has, on 3 occasions, described my approach to the blockade as conservative. Once they meant it as a criticism. Once they meant it as approval. The third time I believe they were genuinely uncertain which one they meant, and so they said it with neither inflection and hoped the ambiguity would resolve itself. A pause. It did not. "How do you manage them?" he said. "The 3 who can move, do they know about each other?" 2 of them know about the third. The third suspects the other 2, but has not been told directly. She considered. It is a deliberate arrangement. Council members who are explicitly coordinating with each other outside the formal session structure become a faction, and factions in the Vethian conclave accrue a specific kind of political weight that changes how every other member reads their position. If they coordinate too visibly, the members who need to feel that they are arriving at a conclusion independently, rather than being carried to it by a competing bloc, will resist the conclusion simply because of who is endorsing it. A pause. The art of it is creating the conditions in which the right people arrive at the same place at approximately the same time, without having appeared to travel together. Corvin thought about that. It was a very specific kind of political craft, and she described it with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had not learned it from a manual. "Your mother taught you that." "My mother demonstrated it. She did not teach it as a technique. She would have found that distasteful. She simply governed, and I watched, and eventually I understood what I had been watching." She paused. She would not have needed to be careful with the council in the way I have needed to be careful. They were afraid of her in a way that is useful for certain things. They are not afraid of me. What are they? She thought about it. Uncertain, she said, finally. Which is, I think, more useful in the long run. A council that is afraid of you will move when you require movement, but they will move only as far as the fear requires. A council that is uncertain of you will occasionally move in directions you did not intend and cannot predict, which is sometimes a problem, but the same uncertainty that produces unpredictable movement also produces the space for something new to be possible. They are still writing the story of what I am. I am trying to influence what story they write without writing it for them. A pause, which is a considerably more complicated project than simply being frightening. "And what am I in that story?" he said. Not pushing, just asking the thing that was there to ask. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, undetermined, she said, "Which is, at the moment, the most useful thing you could be." He thought about undetermined and what it left room for, which was more than most categories left room for. "I can work with undetermined," he said. She said nothing, but the stillness beside him was a different kind of stillness than the earlier one, less the stillness of a person maintaining composure, more the stillness of a person who had set something down that had been very heavy and was noticing the absence of the weight. He thought about that for a long time. The station hummed. The cluster burned in the porthole. "I can put it back in the room," he said. "The report. There's a procedural mechanism, session foundational documents. If the report is resubmitted under that heading, the session chair is obligated to include it. Both delegations respond to it before anything else." She was still. "It would need the session chair," he said. "She'd have to receive it and include it. If she did, Castle couldn't bury it again, not in session." Still nothing. He waited. "Save Thorlane," she said, finally, "the session chair's name. She is thorough, procedurally very rigorous." A pause. "She would include it if it was submitted correctly." "Can you speak to her?" "I already have," she said, and then more quietly, "I spoke to her 3 days ago, before the summit opened. I gave her the document and I asked her what the procedure was for foundational inclusion. She told me." A pause. "I did not know, at that point, whether the author of the document would be here or whether he had been removed entirely from the delegation." He understood then. She had already laid the procedural groundwork. She had been waiting to find out if he was the kind of person who would submit it. She had come to this room, at least in part, to determine that. "He didn't say any of that," he said. "I'll resubmit before the morning session." She said yes. And then they were quiet, and after a while he didn't know when he fell asleep. He suspected she didn't either. What he knew later, what he was told, by 3 separate and increasingly agitated sources within the space of 2 minutes, was that it was the station's 6th hour, and the artificial morning cycle had just ticked on, and Senior Guard Commander Reth Sorrel, Irvin Sorrel's older brother, Corvin noted distantly, which was perhaps relevant, had done a routine check on the Sovereign Veth's location transponder and received a reading that put her in the human residential wing, Sector 4, Room 7, which was Corvin Hale's assigned room, and that Reth Sorrel had then done what any competent guard commander would do when their Sovereign's transponder placed her in an unexpected location, which was to assemble a response team and proceed there directly and override the room seal. What the response team found when they overrode the seal was the Sovereign Veth asleep on a bunk next to a human analyst, both of them fully clothed, both of them obviously deeply and sincerely asleep in the manner of 2 people who had not slept at all before that moment. The Sovereign's head was tilted slightly toward the wall. The human was on his back with one arm at his side, breathing slowly. The room was quiet, and the porthole was doing its best to describe morning. Reth Sorrel and 4 royal guards stood in the doorway. They froze. This was not a figure of speech. Corvin later had it confirmed by 2 members of his own delegation who had been woken by the commotion in the corridor and arrived in time to observe the tableau. 4 Vethian royal guards, men and women who were trained for combat, assassination attempts, spatial decompression emergencies, and the full range of diplomatic crises, stood in the doorway of the room and did not move. Reth Sorrel's hand was still on the door seal. His face had undergone a sequence of expressions that Deputy Ambassador Castle would later describe as a man watching a map reconfigure in real time. The guard nearest the door, a tall woman named Vel Sarat, who had 17 years of active royal protection service, and who was, by all accounts, completely unshakable, had opened her mouth and then closed it again without producing any sound whatsoever. The guard beside her had taken 1 step into the room and then stopped, as if the room contained some invisible boundary at the threshold that his body had registered before his mind caught up. The other 2 had simply gone still in the way that bodies went still when the information arriving was too inconsistent, with every piece of prior information to process in real time. What they were looking at, in the language of the Vethian court, was something that had no exact precedent. The sovereign Veth did not share sleeping quarters with anyone outside the formal bonding rituals of the Vethian succession structure. She did not share sleeping quarters with foreign nationals under any circumstance. She did not present herself in an unbound, sleeping, genuinely off-guard state in front of anyone outside her innermost circle, which did not include humans, and did not appear to have any provision for including humans, because nobody had thought to write that provision, because nobody had imagined a circumstance that would require it. Reth Sorrel was doing all of this processing at visible speed, and what came out the other side, what his 17 years of guard service distilled the situation into was, she is alive, she is safe, she is sleeping, and the human beside her moved toward the wall without being asked. That last detail he could not have explained why he noted. He noted it. Corvin woke with the seal override. He was alert at once. The sound was wrong, which was enough, and he registered the figures in the doorway in the same moment. He registered that the woman beside him was still asleep, and that waking her badly would be worse than almost anything else he could do right now. He put his finger to his lips. Reth Sorrel stared at him. Corvin held very still. He kept his eyes on Reth Sorrel, and he did not move and he did not speak, and after a moment, it was probably 4 seconds, but it felt like considerably more. He heard a quiet shift of breath from beside him, and he knew she was awake. She did not move immediately. That was the thing he remembered afterward, above everything else. She came awake in the same way he did, completely and without theater, and she lay still for a moment. And in that moment she registered the guards in the doorway and she assessed whatever she needed to assess, and then she sat up. Her hair was loose, and there was the impression of the pillow in her cheek, and her court composure was completely absent. And she was, in that moment, startlingly human in the specific way that very controlled people were startlingly human when caught unguarded. Which was that all the control had been the costume, and the person underneath was simply tired, and had wanted rest and had found it. She looked at her guards. The guards looked at her. Reth Sorrel said very carefully, "Your sovereignty." She regarded him for a moment. Her chin came up by a degree, then settled. Then, and this was the thing that made it into every account of the morning, in every language it was subsequently told in, she said, in the same level voice she had used in the session, "Commander Sorrel. The session resumes in 4 hours. I will require tea." A beat of absolute silence. "Yes," said Reth Sorrel, in a voice that had been very thoroughly emptied of everything except the word yes. "Your sovereignty." He withdrew, the guards withdrew, the seal closed. Corvin looked at the ceiling. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Tea." "It is what I require," she said, in the same level voice, and he heard it, the barest thread of something dry and deliberate in the words, and he understood that she was making a decision about what this morning was going to be, and she was making it out loud, and she was making it in his direction. He sat up. His back was slightly wrong from the narrow bunk, and his jacket had the impression of the edge of the blanket across the shoulder, and none of that was worth mentioning. "What do you drink?" She turned her head and looked at him. He could not read, fully, what was in the look. He thought it was something in the register of "I am deciding what to make of you and I have not finished, and I think the making of you is going to take longer than a session." "Something warm," she said. "I don't know what you have." Field Ration Pack has 2 options. One is technically described as calming blend, and the other is technically described as morning preparation. They taste identical. She looked at him for another moment. "Morning preparation," she said. He got up and got it. They sat at the work surface. She had taken the chair this time, and he had the low stool from the corner, and neither of them addressed this arrangement, and drank their considerably suboptimal ration pack tea in the porthole light, which had gone from charcoal to blue-gray as the station cycled further toward morning. "They'll talk," he said. "They will talk," she agreed. "They have been talking since the moment Commander Sorrel opened that door. The question is what they will say." She held the packet cup in both hands, not warming them on it. Her hands were warm, he knew. He had felt the ambient warmth of her in the night, but holding it like something to hold. "I have some influence over what my people will say." "And mine." She considered, less direct influence. "But the shape of things has shifted." He thought about the deputy ambassador who was going to have the morning of his life. He thought about the human diplomatic corps dossier on the sovereign Veth, which described her as cold, transactional, and entirely unmoved by human proximity. He thought about the Terran assessment and the 14 months that had followed it. Shifted how? She set the cup down on the work surface. She was quiet for a moment in the way that had nothing to do with having nothing to say and everything to do with choosing the exact right words. And he waited, because he had learned from 11 hours at the table that this was the quality of silence worth waiting for. "The blockade," she said, "is being maintained by people who need the Terran incident to have a single clear origin and a single clear fault. My conclave council, your deputy ambassador, everyone who has more use for a legible enemy than for an accurate history." She looked at the porthole. "Your report gave them neither, so it was set aside. And the blockade continues, and 6 colony worlds are hungry, and we sit at a marble table and say the same things in different orders." A pause. "I am tired of it." "So am I," he said. She looked at him. "I know, that is why I came to this room." Another pause, smaller. "I slept." "So did I." "I do not sleep well in unfamiliar places," she said. "I have not slept through a station cycle in." She stopped. He watched her decide how much of the sentence to give him. "A long time, since before the Terran incident, since before the blockade." She picked up the cup again. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "It doesn't have to mean something complicated." She looked at him with an expression that was, he thought, somewhere between skeptical and something more careful than skeptical. "You are a human diplomatic analyst." "Third seat." "Third seat," she repeated. A very small pause. "Everything at a negotiation table means something complicated." "We're not at the table." She was quiet. He kept his eyes on the porthole, on the slow brightening of the artificial morning, and he let her have the silence without pressing it, because the thing she had come to this room for was exactly the thing she could not get at the table, which was the experience of not being pressed. He didn't know how he knew that. He suspected it was in the way she had sat in the chair in the dark, very still, watching the porthole and not performing anything for anyone. After a while she said, "The conclave has been told that humans form bonds the way they form agreements, transactional, temporary, revocable, that your people do not sustain loyalty past the point of its usefulness." She looked at the cup. "I was told this, before the summit, as context for how to manage the negotiation. And I am sitting in a human analyst's room drinking field ration tea because he moved toward the wall without being asked and did not make anything of it and did not tell anyone." She set the cup down and looked at him directly. "That does not feel like a species that bonds transiently." Corvin was quiet for a moment. "We're not all the same." "No," she said, "neither are we." He thought about the conclave briefings the human core had received, which had described the Vethian sovereign as a political mechanism more than a person, brilliant, calculated, implacable. He thought about the way she had lain on the bunk with her head tilted toward the wall, completely still, utterly unguarded. "I know." She looked at him. The look was not the session look, the cool distance of a sovereign at a table, and it was not the look he'd caught in the door-opening moment, the stripped quality of someone caught without their armor. It was something else, something he didn't have a name for in Vethian and could only describe in human terms as the look of a person deciding whether to trust the ground they're standing on. "I'll resubmit the report," he said, "before the session opens." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not a smile exactly, because he suspected the sovereign Veth did not smile in the way he would recognize as a smile at this stage of knowing her, but something that moved in that direction, something quieter and more considered. "Yes," she said. "And then we go to the table." "And then we go to the table," he agreed. She stood, he stood. They were very close in the small room, and neither of them stepped back, which he noted without making anything of it. Her eyes were the same blue-gray as deep water, and in the morning light the faint branching of silver that ran at her temples and the backs of her hands was very clear, and he understood that it was not decorative. It was biological, an under-the-skin vein structure that was distinctly Vethian, and he understood without being told that in Vethian social context it probably meant something about her state that he didn't have the vocabulary for. And he was glad she couldn't tell that he was thinking about it. "Commander Sorrel," she said, "will need a very long time to process this morning. He's going to have some opinions. He will have a great many opinions. He will express none of them. He has been my guard commander for 11 years, and he understands that certain opinions are held privately until they are no longer relevant." She looked at the door. "By which point they are usually no longer relevant." A pause. "He is also very loyal, which is, I think, a quality your people understand." "We do," Corvin said. She looked at him. "I know," she said, and then she moved toward the door and he let her go and she was gone. The morning session opened 4 hours and 6 minutes later. Corvin had submitted the reframed Terran report to the session chair, a narrow-shouldered Vethian woman named Seva Thorling, who had received the document without comment and had included it in the morning's foundational materials with the straightforward efficiency of someone who had been told to expect it and was neither surprised nor troubled. Deputy Ambassador Castle had opened his session packet, read the first page, and had looked across the table at Corvin with the specific expression of a man who was doing several kinds of arithmetic simultaneously and was not happy with any of the answers. Corvin had met his gaze. He'd kept his face even. He'd thought about the porthole and the amateur tea, and the way the morning light had come in sideways and made the white of her hair look like something from outside the normal run of things. The sovereign Veth had entered the session chamber with her guard around her, Reth Sorrel at her left shoulder, face entirely neutral, the absolute professional blankness of a man who had, at approximately station hour 6, seen something that he had not seen and was committed to this position. And she had sat at the table, and she had looked at the foundational materials packet in front of her, and she had said, in the measured voice of the chamber, "I propose we begin with the Terran clearance assessment, rather than the 17-month position summary. The document is new to the session record, and both delegations should respond to it before proceeding." Castle's mouth opened, closed. He was a skilled diplomat, he recovered quickly. "With respect, the delegation's preferred sequence is a preference," said Session Chair Seva Thorling without inflection, "and the foundational document protocol is procedural. We begin with the Terran document." A pause. "Deputy Ambassador." Castle looked at Corvin again. Corvin looked at the table. They began with the Terran document. What happened in the hours that followed was not precisely a breakthrough. Breakthroughs in diplomatic contexts were almost always retrospective constructions, things that were called breakthroughs later, when the narrative had been tidied and the causality straightened into something a statement could be made about. What actually happened hour by hour was more like a thaw, a slow loss of rigidity in the framing, a gradual loosening of the fault language that had calcified around every discussion of the blockade for 17 months. The Terran report gave both delegations something to respond to that was neither accusation nor concession, and in the space of that neither nor, things moved that had not moved in a very long time. It was not comfortable. Castle spent the first hour treating the document as if it were a foreign object he was being asked to ingest, and his responses had the quality of a man performing surgical detachment from his own prior positions. The Vethian counselors were more varied. Two of them leaned in immediately, the faction she had mentioned, the ones who could move. Two others went rigid in the way people went rigid when their anchoring story was being rearranged around them. The fifth, an older man named Eth sat very still for a long time reading, and then did something unexpected, which was to ask Corvin directly whether the notification timeline analysis had taken into account the secondary communication channels that the Vethian side had believed were active, but were, in fact, not being monitored by the garrison at the time of the incident. It was the question that cracked it open. Not because of the answer. Corvin's answer was measured, careful, and acknowledged both what he had factored in and what remained unclear, but because asking the question was itself a departure from the fault language, and once a departure had been made in public, it was available for others to follow. By the fourth hour, Eth who was not one of the three she had identified as movable, which meant the Queen had either undercounted or had deliberately not told him about Varen, and he filed the question of which for later, had proposed a working group framework. By the sixth hour, the framework had a timeline. By the eighth hour, Deputy Ambassador Castle had said, in the tone of a man accepting something with his teeth, "The human delegation is prepared to accept the working group structure as a parallel track to the current session, pending final terms." It was not an end to the blockade. It was a door. Corvin had been in enough rooms to know the difference between a closed door and one that had just become possible to open, and this was the second thing. He caught the Queen's eye across the table once, only once briefly, in the seventh hour when Eth was proposing a subclause that would effectively render the fault language non-binding. She did not smile. He did not smile. But something moved between them across the 20 feet of polished marble, quiet and specific, the particular acknowledgement of two people who had done something together in the dark that had made something possible in the light, and who both understood that this was the extent of what they would show the table. He looked back at the document, she looked back at the counselor. The session continued. The second evening brought a formal dinner, a conclave custom, the meal that marked the close of the opening summit week, shared by both delegations at a long table in the station's higher observation tier, where the porthole was not the size of a dinner plate but the entire outer wall. The Murith cluster was fully visible, amber and enormous and unreasonably beautiful, and Corvin stood with a drink he had not tasted and looked at it for a while before anyone found him. "You look," said a voice to his left, "like a man who has done something he is still calculating the cost of." Reth Sorrel. He was in formal guard attire, which meant he was not on active protection detail. Someone else had the Queen tonight, at the dinner table itself, and he was also looking at the Murith cluster, and his voice had the specific texture of a man who was saying something that had been processed and reprocessed many times before being allowed out. "I resubmitted a document," Corvin said. "The cost is probably professional." "Possibly." Sorrel was quiet for a moment. He was a broad, steady man with the kind of face that had clearly once been quite young and had been replaced, feature by feature, by the face of a person who had watched things carefully for a long time. "I served the Sovereign's mother, 12 years. I have served Sarathiel for 11. He said the name without self-consciousness, which told Corvin that whatever category he had been placed in after the morning, it included the privilege of that small informality. "In 23 years I have seen the Sovereign's expression in the morning exactly twice. Once was when her mother died. The other was this morning." Corvin said nothing. "I am not," Sorrel said carefully, "making a statement about what that means. I am a guard commander and a very practical man, and the only conclusions I permit myself are ones that have adequate evidence." He looked at the cluster. "I am observing that the Sovereign has slept. which she has not done fully in what is now approaching 2 years. And that the session today moved in ways I have not observed a session move in 17 months. A very small pause. I am content to observe these things. Corvin thought about what to say. He thought about the bunk and the blanket and the sideways morning light, and the conversation in the dark that neither of them had planned and both of them had needed. He said, "She's extraordinary." Sorrel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with the absolute gravity of a man making a judgment that he intended to stand behind, "Yes, she is." They stood at the window. The Murrith cluster was doing its unreasonable thing with the amber light. "Commander," Corvin said after a while, "Hale, if I came back for the working group sessions, which are going to happen," he kept his eyes on the cluster, is there a protocol question I need to understand?" Reth Sorrel was quiet for what felt like a very considered period of time. Then he said, "The working group structure will require a human technical representative with Terran-specific expertise and conclave clearance." A pause. "Your report gives you both." Another pause. "There is no protocol question." Corvin exhaled slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Sorrel said without heat. "Thank the Conclave's procedural code." He looked at Corvin once directly, and it was the look of a man who had come to a specific conclusion and was telling you about it without using any of the words. "It is very comprehensive." He left. Corvin stood at the window until the dinner arrangements called him in, and then he went. The Queen was at the end of the table, where the protocol required she be. She was in full court dress, something high-necked and deep charcoal with silver at the collar, the barest formal distance from what she'd worn to the session, except that this had a quality of intentionality that the session wear didn't. The way objects chosen for ceremony had a quality of being seen, and she was wearing her hair up, bound in the Vethian court fashion he'd been told was the public norm. She looked, in short, completely and entirely like the sovereign Veth. She looked like a painting of herself. She was being perfectly correct and perfectly present and perfectly everything that was required. He thought about the impression of the pillow in her cheek. He thought about the word morning preparation, delivered with the ghost of something dry and human and wry. He thought about the branching silver blue at her temples, and the fact that it had been, in the morning light, considerably more visible than it had been in any formal context. And he thought about the Vethian cultural index he had read on the shuttle that had a single ambiguous paragraph about what the vein light meant when it was visibly active, and the conclusion the paragraph had come to, which was only that it was involuntary and related to emotional state, and that in Vethian polite society it was considered private in the same way that certain expressions were private, and that one did not remark on it. He had not remarked on it. He was not going to remark on it, but he had noticed. She caught his eye when he sat, not for long, not in a way anyone watching would have reason to note, but in a way he recognized, the same 20 feet of polished stone, the same knowing without showing. Her hair was up. Her expression was composed. The silver at her temples was very faintly, barely, just perceptibly more visible than it had been yesterday. He raised his glass slightly toward the cluster, which was visible even from this table through the observation wall. After a moment, after a very correct and unmemorable pause, she did the same. Across the table, Deputy Ambassador Castle was talking to Ev Varen about subclause language. Somewhere to Corvin's right, someone from his own delegation was asking a conclave junior about Vethian cuisine. The dinner went on, and the working group was real, and the Murrith cluster burned amber in the outer dark, and none of this was simple, and none of it was going to be. But the door was open. He did not see her alone again before the asterisk Sorvith Vel departed the station, 14 hours later. He did not expect to. There were things that had a shape, and he understood the shape of this one for now, for this visit in this week. The working group would convene in 6 weeks. He would be there. That was real, and it was enough to be going on with. He had learned, in the years after Terran, how to be precise about what was real and what was speculation and what was hope, and how to treat each of those three things appropriately without confusing them for each other. He was careful with the category of hope. He had been careless with it once, before Terran, and careful afterward, and he thought careful was the right way to hold something that was fragile and worth keeping. What he did not expect was Irvin Sorrel, the younger, narrower-shouldered brother, the attaché, appearing at the docking bay with a sealed document tube and the expression of a man executing an instruction to the letter and asking no questions. "From the Sovereign's office," Irvin said, and gave him the tube and left. He waited until he was on the Ardent before he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of conclave paper, formal weave, the official kind, and on it, in a hand he had not seen before but recognized by its precision, were 6 lines. No title, no salutation, no signature, only the silver ink mark that was the Sovereign Veth cipher, which he had seen on the session documents and would have known anywhere. "Your report is now in the foundational record. It will remain there. This is not a debt, it is a correction, which is different. A debt can be discharged. A correction is permanent. The Murrith cluster, from the working group station, is visible on the third-tier observation deck in the 3rd hour of the morning cycle. I am told it is larger from there than from the summit station. I expect the calming blend and the morning preparation will taste equally inadequate wherever they are served." He stood in his assigned berth on the Ardent and read it 3 times. He read it the way he read documents he was going to need to remember exactly, not skimming the shape of it, but taking in each sentence separately, giving each one the weight it carried. He thought about what he would write back. He was good at letters. He had not written one that mattered in a long time, and he felt, sitting in the narrow berth with the letter against his palm, that he remembered how. He thought about the 6 weeks and the working group and the procedural code. He thought about the 3rd hour of the morning cycle and the 3rd-tier observation deck, and a small deck porthole framing a cluster that was, apparently, even more amber and enormous from there. Then he folded the letter along its original crease and put it in his jacket pocket, against his chest, which was a thing he had not done with a piece of paper since he was young, and there was someone to carry words from. The Ardent separated from the dock. The Murrith cluster appeared in the small porthole at his shoulder, and then was gone as the ship turned, and then was visible again from a different angle, amber and enormous and entirely worth looking at, and he looked at it for as long as it stayed. He thought 6 weeks. He thought the 3rd hour, the 3rd-tier observation deck. The inadequate T. He thought yes. Outside, the cluster burned, and the ship moved forward, and the blockade was not ended but the door was open, and the shape of the next thing, the real next thing, not the table version, was beginning to become visible in the way that things became visible when you had not been sleeping, and then, at last, you had. And